Okay, and this is the continuation of the series Echoes of Tragedy, Major Racial Massacres in Post-Emancipation America. For the three-part series of the Political Education for Freedom podcast. And let's get into it. So, we begin with the New Orleans Massacre. It's the NO again. I think I talked about the NO before. And was that an education podcast? I think that was the education one. Now, this was an eruption of violence stemming from deep-seated racial tensions and opposition to Reconstruction efforts. Now, remember for the part about the psychological effects, we talked about the different eras. Now, right after the Civil War, that era is considered Reconstruction era, and that's the time when America was trying to integrate formerly enslaved into society. I don't want to say white society because they were not trying to integrate them into white society. They were just trying to integrate them into society. There wasn't any laws specifically against segregating black and white communities, but like I said before, there was obviously formerly enslaved people didn't run to the area where their former masters and other white people that terrorized them. They wasn't going to where they were. They were leaving and going into other places. They would settle in different places, some of the worst places. Soil could be bad. Could have been, riddled with anything that you could think of in a wild. I mean, maybe the most rural parts of town. I mean, anything. They were just going away. They was getting the hell away. And so the government started at, some efforts to reconstruct this fractured nation. And it was fractured. Most civil wars, that it's not good for either side. And so that's what we call the Reconstruction era. And now the New Orleans Massacre, this unfolded against a backdrop of intense racial and political tensions during the early years. It happened on July 30th, 1866, when a black suffrage march organized by African Americans and radical Republicans. And remember, back then, the Republicans were against slavery, and the Southern Democrats were for slavery. Basically, the South were Democrats and the North were Republicans. That shifted, of course, in the 60s, and that it stayed that way for, I mean, at least 100 years, right? This was 1866. The 1960s is when the Southern Democrats switched parties and went to the Republican Party. Now, before, of course, we know we didn't have a side. Both sides was oppressing us. If you were from the South, you were a Republican. If you were from the North, you were a Democrat. And those Democrats from the South, they were considered Dixiecrats. Now, remember the Dixiecrats, this was the side of the Confederacy. This was the Confederates. The Republicans were the Union. That was Lincoln. Remember the Republican Party of Lincoln. And so they were marching, and they were met with violence from a mob of ex-Confederate. And guess what that group, that mob consists of? These were Confederates, right? But guess where they were now? Because it's no longer, the Confederacy doesn't exist anymore, right? Guess what they were? Police officers, firemen. Remember, they're all in the same community, and police officers are supposed to, be upholding the law, protecting and serving, quote unquote. I forget when the use of that term kind of upticked, because that was not the purpose of police officers. But you have police officers, and remember I said, right, after the Civil War, Lincoln could have done something about those Confederates, those ex-Confederates. He could have jailed them. He could have kicked them out the country. He could have took their citizenships. Hell, send their ass to Mexico. He could have done a lot, but guess what he did? And his predecessor, he just amped it up on 1,000. But he let them basically control or continue to control the South. And they become police officers and firemen. Now, you're a fireman. You're supposed to be putting out fires. Why the hell are you starting massacres or even being a part of mobs, for that matter? Now, the purpose of the march was to support a new Louisiana Constitutional Convention. And that Constitutional Convention was aimed at granting voting rights and civil liberties to freedmen. As the marchers convened outside the Mechanics Institute in New Orleans, they were confronted by opponents who viewed the empowerment of African Americans as a direct threat to social order. The confrontation quickly escalated into a full-blown massacre as the largely unarmed marchers were attacked. Over the course of the day, the violence spread throughout the city. By the end, official reports counted nearly 38 dead and over 100 wounded. But the actual numbers were likely much higher, especially among the Black community. Of course, we know that. The majority of the victims, of course, were African American. And the brutality of the attack was a demonstration of the resistance to Reconstruction and racial equality. Now, Lincoln knew this. Lincoln knew that even though the South was defeated, technically. He knew that they was putting up resistance. He knew that they wasn't just finna take it and lie down. But because Abraham Lincoln was a white supremacist who didn't care about black people, he allowed these people to just go about galloping, just go about, the community as if, it wasn't, no big deal, right? Now, the reason for the Constitutional Convention was the state legislature enacting black codes. And we actually are going to talk about black codes in I'm going to go into a little bit of detail of black codes in one of the other massacres that we'll talk about. So just remember, they were protesting against black codes. And some people may know what black codes is, some people not. It's like this is 8th grade history. Some of y'all ain't took it in 30 years, 20 years, whatever. It's a part of the Reconstruction period that's discussed or that's taught in 8th grade. So they were protesting black codes. Now, the parade of marchers had basically thwarted off the mob on the other side of Canal. And if you've been to New Orleans during Mardi Gras or Bayou Classics, Canal Street. Now, I don't know where exactly the Mechanics Institute is. I think that's something that'd be worth looking at. I haven't looked at a map, so I'm pretty sure I would know that area once I look at it on the map. But they thwarted them off on the other side of Canal. But once they made it to the Mechanics Institute, which is where the convention was, because the convention was taking place inside the Mechanics Institute. And so they basically was met with more violence by a gang of white supremacists and ex-Confederates, which was made up of some policemen and firemen. But here's where it got worse. Fire sirens went off, and that signaled the police to attack. Here's some of the, I believe this is some of the, because the massacre was investigated, there was some reports circulated in newspapers and government documents. Of course, we know ultimately no one was punished, or largely went unpunished. But here's what some of those papers said. There was panic because the police and firemen, armed, surrounding that building and began advancing. The attack was premeditated, led Police Chief Harry T. Hayes. What he was doing at the time was recruiting policemen from Confederate veterans. They stormed in and started shooting, chasing people down the street. And this was what circulated in some of those news reports. Now, remember, we're in the South, right? And remember, I was talking about how the Confederacy, or how the Union, should have punished the Confederates. But of course, they didn't punish them, right? What they do? They gave them their jobs. They gave them jobs. They gave them their jobs back. One of those jobs they gave back was the former mayor, that was John Monroe, he was reinstated as acting mayor. He was just fighting on the Confederacy. He was just fighting on the opposite side. And then you're going to reinstate him as the mayor? Come on, man. This is waiting to happen. So it was about 130 Black New Orleans residents that was marching. The mayor, who was a former Confederate, organized and led the mob of ex-Confederates, to block the 130 Black marchers. The damn mayor ordered them to block them. Now, this is why the eyewitness, or some of those papers, or I guess so we consider those. So those eyewitness accounts, because it was investigated. This is why they said, oh, this was premeditated. The mayor did this. Now, the mayor, still the mayor, of course, who led this attack, he claimed they were sent to put down unrest that could come from the convention. But opposition would say the purpose was to prevent the meeting. So they're marching to the Institute where the convention is being held. And then when they're about a block or so away from the Institute, shots just ring off. Now, we can assume who shot the shots, right? So once they reached the Institute, the police and the white mob attacked them, beating the marchers while others rushed inside the building for safety. Now then, remember, the police and mob surrounded the Institute and opened fire on the building, just shooting indiscriminately in the windows. Just imagine. I mean, they didn't have machine guns back then, but I guess they had, like muskets or whatever, something like that. Either way, this is a mob. Also, the police, who had access to the city's armory, and they are surrounding this building where the convention is held, and then they just start just firing shots. Boom, 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 boom. Boom, 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 boom. This is this is a government meeting. This is a government convention. This ain't like it was no damn pep rally. This was a government meeting. It was everything was legal. After they just started shooting up the place, just shooting up everywhere, purposely shooting into the windows, they rushed the building. They got inside and began shooting into the crowd of delegates. What the hell? Imagine your city, let's say it's city council meeting or something like that, and a mob surrounds the building where the city council meeting is being held, and they just start shooting. Then they get in and they just start shooting up people inside. They have to have known there wasn't gonna be any consequences to this. Why would you go to this extreme lengths? When the mob ran out of ammunition, the delegates started fighting them back. So the delegates kind of beat them back, right? Because they were out of bullets. This is what they did. They left the building, regrouped, returned, and started breaking down the doors and firing on the unarmed delegates. Now, as the firing continued, some of the delegates attempted to flee or surrender. Some of those who surrendered, mostly black, were killed dead. They were shot dead. They said, okay, shit, fuck it, we ain't gonna do it. All right, let us go. Bam, they shoot them anyway. Now, by this point, the rioters and victims now included people who was never at the Institute. Remember that, spilling over. You letting the worst part of your society control your society. The worst part of society controlling society. That is a problem. Weed those people out. If you don't weed them out, do something with them, but get them out of sight. Get them out of the overall public eyes. And if they enact violence against people, punish them publicly to deter others from doing the same. That's what you say the reason for the laws, right? That's what you say the reason for punishment is to deter others. So if we go by your logic, because this is what they did to reinforce slavery, enact violence, killing, and then they would force the slaves to watch it. And what was their reason for doing it? Oh, you need to see it so that you know this is what happens when you try some shit like this. Well, okay, do the same thing to them. Now, what happened then? African Americans were shot on the street, pulled off of streetcars, beaten or killed. So there's different reports of the number of people that were injured and that died. It was about 300 people total that was injured and or killed. So the official reports reported 38 dead, which I stated before. They reported 38 dead and over 100 wounded. Other reports show 200 Black Union war veterans were killed, including 40 delegates at the convention. 238 people were killed, 46 were wounded. Now, like I said, the massacre, the New Orleans Massacre of 1866, went largely unpunished. First off, every single member of the police force should have been immediately jailed and fired. The mayor, at a minimum, should have been jailed and fired. And the firemen, they all should have been jailed and fired. All of these people should have been removed from office. They should have been kicked out of town. So those from the North was upset about the violence, and I'm assuming after the investigations and the reports, they figured, okay, well, we got to do something about this. And what they did was they helped basically the Republican Party of Lincoln take control of the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate in the 1866 elections. It's about 1 year after the Civil War. They have the elections of 1866. the Republican Party eventually take over the House and the Senate. Now, remember, because this happened in July of 1866, the elections of 1866 didn't happen until, of course, around November. After this, which the next massacre we'll talk about is the Memphis Massacre of 1866. The Memphis Massacre happened in May of 1866. New Orleans was then July of 1866. And then you have the elections in November of 1866. And so, of course, in response to these massacres in the South, they passed Reconstruction Acts of 1867. Those acts called for the army occupation of the 10 former Confederate states. And of course, some voting rights measures. And of course, martial law was reimposed by the federal government. Because remember, this happened about 4 years, I want to say. So the Union Army had already imposed martial law. And that martial law ended in May of 1866. And then this happens in July of 1866. Right after martial law ended, then they have this massacre led by the mayor and the city police department. Now, the mayor and some other city officials were removed from office for their part in the massacre. But that was about the most punishment that happened from this. That's it? You just remove him from office? This dude is responsible for nearly 300 deaths. And also probably a resurgence of the war. Because, wars start, they have, what they call little skirmishes. Well, we call little skirmishes or whatever. But I guess at some point, they actually declare war. But it always starts off from like little skirmishes here and there. And a skirmish is just like a small, it's not a battle. So it's not like the Battle of Gettysburg. It's not huge, but it's small. It's not big enough where it's a battle. And it's small enough where they don't consider it wartime, but they know that it's events that led to the war. So it's enough agitation where if enough of them happen, a war is near. And so that mayor should have never been there. These are city officials. These are officers, police officers who're supposed to uphold the law. At that point, I don't even know what that meant. Or we don't know what that meant because it's right after the Civil War. Technically, black people wasn't citizens. But you have a war. You have people who basically started their own country. And then after the war, instead of you removing those people from office, you put them back in office. And then you're pissed off that violence like this breaks out at the hands of those officials. This just shows the lengths that they would go to restore, quote unquote, restore racial order. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So the lack of accountability and continued violence against African Americans in the South became a somber theme of the Reconstruction era. As we remember the New Orleans Massacre, it's crucial to understand the political, social, and economic tensions that fueled such violence and to recognize the enduring impact of these events on the struggle for racial justice in America. The tragic moment in history serves as a reminder for the long and difficult path towards equality and the importance of continued vigilance in our fight.